December 6th, 1944. 2 a.m. The rain fell like iron nails on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. It was cold, the kind of cold that made fingers stiff, that turned breath into white ghosts, that crept through wool and steel and settled into the bones. Along the jagged rocks at the base of the 100-foot cliff, 225 men crouched in darkness, their boots slick with seawater and mud. They were United States Army Rangers, and before them loomed not just rock and earth, but a fortress the Germans believed invincible. Above, embedded in the Norman coastline like a crown of concrete and steel, sat 6 155mm artillery guns, each one capable of raining death upon the beaches of Omaha and Utah, where thousands of American soldiers would land at dawn. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and in the silence between those sounds, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder whispered the order that would turn boys into legends. This was not a battle that history would remember with parades or monuments for decades to come. This was not D-Day's grand opening act, though it occurred on that very morning. This was something quieter, darker, and in its own way, more terrifying. A vertical assault against gravity, against concrete, against an enemy who held every advantage but one. The will of free men who understood that tyranny dies not in the light of idealism, but in the mud and blood of impossible missions. The fortress at Pointe du Hoc was no accident of war. It was designed by the Third Reich's finest military engineers, men who understood that the cliffs themselves were the first line of defense. A sheer wall of limestone rising from the sea, pocked with craters from months of Allied bombing, yet still standing. Atop those cliffs sat casemates, reinforced concrete bunkers built to withstand naval bombardment, and within them, the guns. Intelligence reports had marked this position as critical. If those cannons remained operational when the invasion fleet arrived, they could pivot and sweep the beaches clean of life. Thousands would die before they touched sand. The Rangers had trained for this. They had climbed cliffs in England, scaled wet rock in Scotland, practiced with rope ladders and grappling hooks until their hands bled. But training and reality are separated by a chasm no amount of preparation can bridge. The men who huddled in the landing crafts as they approached the cliffs were not naive. They knew the statistics. They knew that captured German documents referred to Pointe du Hoc as unassailable. They knew that above them, in the dark, soldiers of the Wehrmacht waited, men who had held these cliffs for years, who had mined the approaches, zeroed their mortars, and strung barbed wire across every path. But the Rangers also knew something the Germans did not. They knew hunger, not the hunger of the stomach, though many had grown up in the Depression and understood that well, but the hunger for a world where men did not bow, where borders did not burn, where children did not disappear into camps and smoke. The landing crafts struck the base of the cliffs 6 minutes late. 6 minutes, an eternity in war. The original bombardment had scattered the boats, and as the ramps dropped, the Rangers waded not onto a beach, but into a nightmare of mud and stone. Immediately, fire erupted from above. German grenades tumbled down the cliff face, exploding in the surf. Machine gun fire stitched the water into white froth. Men fell. Others pressed forward, dragging rocket-propelled grappling hooks from the boats, hooks attached to rope ladders and thin climbing ropes soaked with seawater, now 30 pounds heavier than they should have been. The first hooks fired upward with a wet hiss, trailing ropes behind them like umbilical cords between earth and sky. Many fell short. The ropes, waterlogged, could not carry their load. Others caught, digging into the soft earth at the cliff's edge, and the men began to climb. Hand over hand, boots scrambling for purchase on wet limestone, they ascended into the dark, while above them the Germans leaned over the edge and cut the ropes. Men fell, twisting through space, hitting rock or water with sounds that do not leave the memory. But the Germans had not expected this. The Rangers kept coming. For every rope cut, 2 more were thrown. For every man who fell, another took his place. Some climbed the rope ladders. Others used toggle ropes and pure grip strength, fingers clawing into crevices, legs pushing against stone. And as they climbed, the destroyers offshore, USS Satterlee and HMS Talibant, fired directly at the cliff top, shells screaming overhead so close the Rangers could feel the heat, could taste the cordite. The naval guns walked their fire along the German positions, forcing the defenders back just long enough for the 1st Rangers to crest the summit. Sergeant Leonard Lommel was among them. He rolled over the edge and into a crater, gasping, his hands raw and bleeding. Around him, the landscape of Pointe du Hoc was not earth but moon, cratered, smoking, a hellscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The months of bombing had turned the fortifications into a maze of destruction, and in that maze the battle became intimate. Room to room, crater to crater. Men fought with rifles, grenades, knives, and fists. The Germans, many of them veteran troops, gave ground slowly. They knew these bunkers. They knew every trench, every fallback position. But they had not accounted for the ferocity of men who had just climbed 100 feet of cliff under fire. The Rangers expected to find the guns immediately. Intelligence had been clear. 6 155mm artillery pieces in reinforced casemates. But as they secured the positions, a terrible realization dawned. The casemates were empty. Inside, the concrete bunkers sat only telephone poles, painted and arranged to resemble cannons from the air. Dummy guns. The real artillery had been moved. For a moment, the weight of that discovery pressed down like the cliff itself. They had climbed. They had bled. They had left men broken on the rocks below. And for what? Wooden deceptions? But Sergeant Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn did not stop. While the rest of the force consolidated the position and prepared for the inevitable German counterattack, Lommel and Kuhn moved inland, following their training, following instinct. They advanced through hedgerows and across muddy fields, knowing that guns that size could not simply vanish. And then, a quarter-mile south of Pointe du Hoc, hidden in an orchard beneath camouflage netting, they found them. All 6 guns, unguarded, pointed toward Utah Beach. The 2 men moved like shadows. They carried thermite grenades, designed to burn hot enough to melt steel. Lommel placed grenades in the traversing mechanisms and recoil systems of 2 guns, destroying them in seconds. Kuhn did the same to another. They retreated, found more grenades from a supply dump nearby, and returned to disable the remaining 3. In less than 15 minutes, 2 Army Rangers accomplished what months of bombing had not. They rendered the guns of Pointe du Hoc permanently silent. But the night was not over. Dawn came, and with it, the German counterattacks. Throughout June 6th and into June 7th, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were surrounded. Reinforcements could not reach them. Ammunition ran low. Morphine ran out. The men fought from craters and bunkers, using captured German weapons when their own ran dry. They held a perimeter no larger than a football field, and the Germans came in waves, infantry supported by snipers and mortars, probing for weakness, testing the line. The Rangers had expected glory, perhaps. They had expected the satisfaction of a mission completed, the relief of reinforcements, the pride of victory. What they experienced instead was isolation, thirst, the screaming of wounded men they could not fully treat, the weight of wondering if anyone even knew they were still alive. By the time relief finally arrived on June 8th, only 90 of the original 225 Rangers were still able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc were stained with their blood, and the fortress, the impregnable fortress, was theirs. Among the dead and the exhausted, among the spent shell casings and the silence that follows battle, something had changed. The German soldiers captured in the aftermath spoke with a curious mixture of respect and disbelief. They had been told the Americans were soft, that they were rich boys playing at war, that they lacked the discipline and the will of the German soldier. The propaganda posters had shown them as fat and laughing, more concerned with jazz music and Hollywood than with sacrifice. But the men who climbed those cliffs were not the men of propaganda. They were farmers' sons and factory workers, immigrants and native-born, Catholics and Protestants and Jews, united not by blood or soil, but by an idea, that there exist things worth dying for that are not flags or leaders, but principles, freedom, the right to speak, the right to live without fear of the knock at the door in the night. The Germans at Pointe du Hoc had believed their fortress made them safe. They had trusted in concrete and steel, in the vertical face of nature itself. But fortresses do not hold when the men attacking them carry something stronger than weapons. They carry conviction. In the months and years that followed, the Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc rarely spoke of it. There were no parades specifically for them, no immediate monuments. The world's attention was on the larger invasion, on the thousands who stormed the beaches, on the tank columns and the airborne drops. And perhaps that was fitting. The Rangers had not climbed for recognition. They had climbed because they were ordered to. Yes, but also because they understood, in the way soldiers sometimes do, that history is not made by the men who wait for easy paths. One object, carried by many of the Rangers that night, became in its way a symbol of everything they fought for: the simple K-ration chocolate bar. It was not gourmet. It was not Belgian or Swiss. It was mass-produced, utilitarian, bland, a small brown square wrapped in wax paper designed by nutritionists to provide calories and nothing more. But to the men on those cliffs, it represented something the Axis powers could never replicate: American abundance. The industrial capacity of a nation that could afford to sweeten the rations of its soldiers while Germany was rationing bread and Japan was sending men to fight on handfuls of rice. The Germans had found these chocolate bars on captured American soldiers earlier in the war, and the discovery had unsettled them. Not because of the chocolate itself, but because of what it implied: that America had so much, it could waste resources on comfort, on morale, on the idea that a soldier's spirit mattered as much as his rifle. After Pointe du Hoc, medics found chocolate bars in the pockets of dead Rangers. Some had melted. Others were uneaten, saved for a moment of rest that never came. But they were there, small, mundane, and yet profound. A reminder that the men who stormed that fortress came from a country that believed its soldiers deserved not just orders, but care. Not just duty, but dignity. The fortress at Pointe du Hoc still stands. The craters remain, filled now with grass and wild flowers. The bunkers are open to the sky, their roofs blown away by shell fire, their walls tagged by time and weather. Tourists walk the ground where Rangers bled, and they look up at the cliffs and try to imagine what it took to climb them in the dark, under fire, with the weight of the world's freedom on their backs. But the true monument is not the concrete. It is not the preserved landscape or the marble markers. The monument is the act itself, the willingness of free men to do the impossible, because it was necessary. Because tyranny does not fall to those who wait for convenient moments or fair fights. It falls to those who understand that some cliffs must be climbed, no matter the cost. The Germans believed Pointe du Hoc was unassailable. They believed their fortress could not be taken. They were wrong, not because their engineering was flawed, but because they misunderstood the nature of the enemy they faced. The United States Army Rangers did not climb those cliffs because they were superhuman. They climbed because they were human, flawed, afraid, and free. And that made all the difference. In the end, the fortress fell not in weeks or months, but in a single night. And in falling, it proved a truth older than war itself, that walls, no matter how high, cannot stand against men who refuse to kneel.